Some songs get old. These just got better. 1974 was a year of accidents, jokes that turned into hits,
A slip and a kicking from the hip. Everybody was kung fu fighting.
disasters that turned into masterpieces, throwaway tracks that outsold everything around them. So today we're counting down 10 songs that made 1974 impossible to forget. And trust me, number 1 was never even supposed to leave the room. 10. The Joker.
Play my music in the sun. I'm a joker.
Steve Miller did something no songwriter is ever supposed to do. He stopped trying to write anything new and instead reached back into his own old records, pulling out characters he had already invented: the Joker, the Smoker, the Midnight Toker, and stitching his past selves together
And I'm a joker. I'm a smoker. I'm a midnight talker.
into one lazy, grinning anthem that felt like a man winking at his entire back catalog. And right in the middle of it, he sang a word that does not exist. Pompatus, he called it, a piece of pure nonsense he made up on the spot, and nobody knew what it meant, least of all him. Yet somehow that mystery only made people love the song more. The whole thing drifts along on a wolf whistle and a loose, sun-drunk guitar, sounding like a man far too relaxed to care whether any of it holds together. And that ease is exactly why it works. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1974, the first chart topper of Steve Miller's long career, and the moment a journeyman finally became a household name. 52 years later, that slippery riff and that invented word still pull us in, while the song quietly reminds us that sometimes the most memorable thing you can do is simply refuse to explain yourself. 9. Rock the Boat. Nobody at the label thought this was a single, so it sat buried on an album for months, a light, bouncing little love song that everyone kept walking past on the way to the records they actually believed in, until it was finally released almost as an afterthought, the kind of decision made with a shrug and low expectations. Then the dance floors got hold of it, and everything changed, because in the clubs, where DJs were quietly inventing a brand new way to keep a room moving from midnight until dawn, Rock the Boat became a heartbeat. The steady pulse, the rising strings, the joyful vocal gliding over the top, none of it sounded like the future. And yet that is exactly what it was. Disco being born in real time on a record nobody had bothered to bet on. It climbed all the way to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and is now remembered as one of the very first songs to carry that new sound to the top of the American charts, an accidental pioneer of a movement about to swallow the decade whole. Half a century on, that irresistible groove still lifts a room the second it starts, while the song reminds us that the future rarely announces itself with any warning. It simply starts playing in the corner of a room and waits for the rest of us to catch up. 8. Killer Queen.
Extraordinarily nice. She's a killer queen. Got body.
Queens were nearly broke and still waiting for the world to notice them when Freddie Mercury sat down one evening and wrote an entire song before the night was over. He wrote it about a high-class call girl, elegant, expensive, and dangerous, a woman who drifted through wealth and power like she'd been born to it, painted in lines so precise and glittering they sounded like champagne being poured slowly over a blade. It was different from anything the band had done before, lighter and wickeder and dripping with a theatrical style nobody had heard from them yet, and it quietly announced a whole new confidence. Mercury always said the words arrived before the music, which for him was almost unheard of, and he built the entire shimmering thing around a character who was pure performance, showing the world in 3 short minutes exactly who Queen were about to become. The song climbed into the top 5 in Britain and became the band's first genuine hit on both sides of the Atlantic, the precise moment they stopped being a struggling art rock experiment and started turning into one of the biggest acts on earth. 52 years later, those stacked, cascading harmonies and that sly, strutting melody still dazzle every time they play, while the song reminds us that elegance, when it is done properly, is really just another and far more graceful kind of danger. 7. Waterloo.
Waterloo, I was defeated, you won the war.
4 young Swedes stood together backstage in Brighton, England, on an April night in 1974, waiting for the 3 minutes that would decide the entire course of their lives. Outside their own country, they were complete unknowns, and the Eurovision Song Contest was their single shot at the wider world. So they gambled it all on a bright, glittering, slightly ridiculous pop song that compared falling in love to surrendering at a famous military defeat. It was strange, and it was joyful, and it was nothing at all like the polite, tasteful ballads that Eurovision usually rewarded, which is exactly why it cut clean through the noise. When the votes finally came in and their name reached the top, ABBA stopped being a small local act in that instant and became something the whole planet would very soon memorize. Waterloo went on to top the charts across Europe and reached the top 10 in America, an almost unheard of feat for a Eurovision winner, and it became the launch pad for one of the most staggeringly successful pop careers in the history of recorded music. 52 years later, that stomping piano intro and those bright, interlocking voices still pull people straight onto their feet, while the song reminds us that surrender is not always the end of a story. 6. Sweet Home Alabama. It started, of all things, as an argument. Neil Young had written a pair of songs criticizing the American South for its history and its sins, and a young band out of Florida decided they were not going to let that stand, so Lynyrd Skynyrd answered him directly, calling him out by name inside their own lyrics and defending their home against an outsider's sweeping judgment. But here's the twist that most people miss, because the truth is they genuinely admired Neil Young, they were fans of his, and the whole exchange was far less a war than a heated conversation between artists who respected each other much more than the feud ever let on. Out of all that friction came a guitar riff so easy and sun-warmed, it felt like a back road in the middle of July. 3 simple chords that sound as though they had always existed and were merely waiting to be discovered. The song reached the top 10 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became the anthem the band could never once escape, played at every single show for the rest of their lives. 52 years later, that endlessly rolling riff still turns a crowd of strangers into one single voice, while the song reminds us that pride is a genuinely complicated thing worth defending and worth questioning, and almost never as simple as the people happily singing along tend to believe. 5. Cats in the Cradle.
And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man.
The saddest song of the entire year did not begin as a song at all, and it did not even begin with Harry Chapin, because his wife Sandy first wrote it as a quiet poem about a distant father and a son who slowly grows up to become the spitting image of him. She handed those words to Harry, who was busy as always, forever working and touring, a brand new father himself who was hardly ever actually home to see his own child. And when he finally read what she had written, he went completely silent because he understood at once that the poem was really about him. He set her lines to a gentle, circling melody, following a little boy who wants nothing more than his father's time, and a father who somehow never quite has it to give until the roles quietly reverse and it is suddenly, heartbreakingly, far too late. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in late 1974, the only chart topper of Harry Chapin's whole career, which feels almost unbearably fitting. 52 years later, that plain acoustic guitar and that devastating final verse still stop people cold wherever it plays, while the song reminds us that time is the one single thing we always assume we will have more of later, right up until the morning we discover that we don't. 4. Benny and the Jets. Elton John did not want this to be a single, and he said so plainly, convinced it was odd and unremarkable, a strange little sketch about a made-up futuristic band that could only embarrass him if it flopped. What he did not yet know was that a radio station just across the river from Detroit had begun spinning it on heavy rotation, and black soul stations across the city were embracing it with an enthusiasm almost no glam rock record had ever earned. The cheering, clapping crowd you hear all over the track was, in fact, an elaborate trick, because the song was cut quietly in a studio, and the producer simply stitched in applause, whistles, and shouts lifted from old concert tapes to conjure a live audience for a band that never existed. It climbed all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and crossed over onto the soul charts, carrying him somewhere he had never once planned to go and quietly reshaping how the world heard him. 52 years later, that hammered, stomping piano and that stuttered, echoing chorus still fill any room they enter, while the song reminds us that sometimes the crowd hears the magic in something long before the person who actually made it ever does. We're into the top 3 now, and if you're loving this trip back through 1974, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which of these has surprised you the most so far. Let's find out what made the podium. 3. Band on the Run.
Hope you have it, mama. Band on the run.
Everything went wrong before a single note was recorded. Just days before Paul McCartney was due to fly out to Lagos, Nigeria to make the album, half of Wings suddenly quit and walked out on him, leaving him with no drummer and forcing him to sit down and play the drums himself. When he finally arrived, the studio turned out to be barely finished and half-built, and then, one night while walking through an unfamiliar city, Paul and Linda were robbed at knife point, the thieves making off with a bag that held the only demos and handwritten lyrics for the record they had traveled all that way to create, forcing him to rebuild entire songs from memory alone. Out of all that chaos somehow came something soaring and cinematic, and instead it became one of the greatest records of McCartney's entire life after the Beatles. The song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and proved beyond any doubt that he could build a whole second act entirely on his own terms. 52 years later, that slow-burning opening and that triumphant closing gallop still thrill, while the song reminds us that escape is never clean or simple. You carry the wreckage with you, and if you are lucky, you build something out of it. 2. Kung Fu Fighting.
Snip and a kicking from the hip. Everybody was kung fu fighting.
There were exactly 10 minutes left on the studio clock. Carl Douglas had already spent hours carefully recording what everyone in the room assumed would be his big breakout song, and now the producer suddenly needed a B-side, and needed it fast. Just something to fill the flip side of the record that nobody was ever really expected to listen to anyway. He turned and asked Douglas whether he happened to have any spare lyrics lying around, and Douglas pulled out a rough little scrap he had scribbled after watching a group of kids throwing kung fu kicks at each other on a London street. But somebody at the label did hear it, turned the single around, and made the joke the main event, and it went on to sell 11 million copies and top charts all over the world, a song built in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee, becoming one of the best-selling singles ever recorded. 52 years later, that chopping rhythm and those playful shouts still fill dance floors instantly, while the song reminds us that joy never once waits for permission, and the thing you toss off without a second thought is sometimes the very thing that outlives everything else. 1. You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet.
Baby, you just ain't seen nothing yet. Nothing yet. You ain't.
This song was never, ever supposed to exist for anyone but a single person. Randy Bachman's brother Gary had stuttered all through his childhood, and so, purely as a private joke between brothers, Randy recorded a version of a half-finished song in which he stuttered his way through the entire thing from start to finish just to tease him one single copy meant to be quietly mailed off to Gary and heard by absolutely no one else on earth. Then the record label came looking for a hit because the band's new album was missing an obvious single, and almost as a sheepish confession, Randy admitted there was this one silly little track lying around, a joke take where he could be heard laughing at the end and stumbling clumsily over every other line. The label heard it and flatly refused to let it go. He tried desperately to re-record it properly, sung straight and clean, and they hated the polished version because they wanted the stutter They wanted the laugh, they wanted the joke, exactly as it was. It became the one and only number one of Bachman-Turner Overdrive's entire career, topping the Billboard Hot 100 in November 1974, and the most carefully planned and polished songs of that whole year are largely forgotten now, while the one that truly survived was a pure accident meant for an audience of one. 52 years later, it still reminds us that the thing you never intended to share is sometimes the truest and most lasting thing you will ever make. These 10 songs from 1974 prove that the best music is rarely the music that went according to plan. If this trip back moved you, subscribe and stay with us, because there are even older classics waiting to be remembered. We'll see you in the next one.